Hi guys. Hi guys and welcome back to our channel Sharang and Sharvari. You might have noticed that we did not post a video this Wednesday because we were pretty busy, caught up in our own lives, and we were also thinking of content which would be a bit different, a bit new that we could bring to this channel. And today's topic, as you see, is something that is Sharang's area of interest. Like, I have personally not read about this topic a lot, but when he asked me to, prepare a bit, I did read upon it. And of course, he is the knowledge expert in this case, I must say. Whatever, like he has read a lot about it. But before that, I see that we are very, very close to reaching 400 subscribers. So in a year, that is fantastic to reach 400 subscribers. Like we started this channel last July. And to reach this point in 1 year, I think like maybe it might not be a lot, but we really consider it our personal achievement.
Yeah.
So thank you guys for the support that you gave us. Now let's come to the start of the topic that Sharang will introduce us
Yes.
to. What are we going to talk about?
So today we're going to talk about the fiercest warrior cultures in all of human history. So how did I come to this topic, right? I was listening to history and I was reading. Like I love history is like my pet peeve now. I love listening to history podcasts and find out more about the history of this world. There are numerous sources, and eventually when you read enough history you realize that history always rhymes. Like it's never the same, but it always rhymes. What do I mean by that? There are always historical patterns, and when you tease out historical patterns you're able to get deep wisdom about yourself, because the past is often a guiding tool for the future.
Yeah.
So what do I mean? That in what sense am I saying that the past guides the future, or how is this relevant, so on and so forth? If you look enough at history, and if you study historical wars, if you study geopolitics and historical geopolitics to see how borders changed, you'll realize that at every point in history, or at any given point of time in history, there was often a race or a group of people. I should not have said race, sorry.
Yeah.
But a group or a culture of people which were absolutely militarily dominant over all of their peers, and they were admired, and maybe they terrified their neighbors,
Feared by.
yeah. And I will give a brief overview of every one of those people, what makes them special, why is it that they're remembered even today, and what was it, because I do not believe that there are some racially superior fighting groups and some racially inferior fighting groups. I think fighting is something that's innate to men, not women, but men for sure. So what cultural incentives allowed these groups to completely dominate their rivals, right? And we begin with prehistory. So prehistory is before recorded history, where man was basically an animal. And if you've ever seen chimpanzees, the way chimpanzees will attack each other is eight. Like chimpanzees they'll wait until there's a 4-to-1 numerical supremacy in terms of ratios. They'll attack. Four males will gang up on one male. They'll hold him down, and then they'll tear out his throat and genitals. And that's usually how chimpanzees fight. And human beings are a cousin in terms of evolution.
Yeah.
And especially men, are evolved for war. Why do I say that? Because why do we have depositions on our knuckles? Like, why are our knuckles protruding? One theory is that they evolved for punching. Or like, if you look at, especially if you compare the anatomy of men versus women, you'll find that men have certain accumulations of, like, men usually have thicker skulls, so on and so forth. So men have thicker front pectoral muscles. So in a lot of ways, the human body is optimized for throwing things, which is, like, the mother of all inventions, the spear. In that sense, right?
I remember we had this chapter in the third standard about the prehistoric era.
Yes.
And in that, it was pretty basic since it was the third standard, but we had all these tools and weapons that the early man or the nomadic man used. And I remember seeing a picture of a nomadic man throwing a spear,
Yes.
maybe to hunt
Yes.
or kind of killing animals and everything, but maybe later it was used as a form of warfare.
So the thing is, a chimpanzee or a gorilla are much stronger than us, right? But still they cannot throw. Why? Because they cannot balance well. But human beings can balance on their one foot, and they can use the entire body's torque to throw things.
Yeah.
And that is why even a small child can throw a rock with enough force to kill an adult. And there are reports, actually, when the when the Native Americans of the South America, they were fighting the Portuguese and whatever. So people with throwing rocks were actually in some cases able to defeat people who were using guns, or like the old versions of guns, because you had to wait a lot of time. There was this giant rifle, you had to load the powder in, lock it in, put in a musket and the fire. But in that time, they could throw so many rocks. And in fact, the Romans too had these lead pellets that they would put in a sling and throw to devastating accuracy. And if you think it won't be that effective, imagine an army of 300 men. They all have slings and they all throw lead pellets in your direction. What do you think? What sort of damage do you think that will do? So anyway, so in prehistory there was this kind of tribal warfare, and contrary to popular belief, we were not that peaceful, because they did an anthropological study of like societies which are not which do not have civilization in terms of farming or something like this, and you find routinely that 30 to 40% of the male population dies in combat.
Yeah.
That's insane, right? That means that generation after generation, men are being selected to be to be great fighters. And in wars, often technology made the decisive gave people a decisive advantage, right? So, but in prehistory, how much could it, give? So it was mostly about numerical supremacy, right? And then we come to the age of civilization, right? So there are different ways to go about civilization, right? But I'll keep it very simple and very brief,
Right. Yeah.
So some of the first civilizations of the world are those of the Bronze Age civilizations. So they are civilizations of Harappa, right? So the Harappan civilization in India, and the places like Uruk or Mesopotamia.
Mohenjo-daro?
Yeah, Harappa, Mohenjo-daro
Yeah,
is
they're in one area.
yeah,
Right.
that's in
Okay.
modern day Pakistan.
Yeah.
In Pakistan, before India, whatever.
Yes.
And today, basically in modern day Syria, Iraq, that's roughly where Mesopotamia is. And so this is the area where the first civilizations of the world came in. And there, one of the first people to leave their mark, and this is kind of at the border of prehistory and history, where they're known by different names. So they're either the Yamanaya or the Indo-Aryans. So these are essentially a white people who originated in the Caucasus Mountains, and one branch of them conquered westwards, and one branch of them conquered or emigrated eastwards.
Oh,
right. So
okay.
that is the root cause of the Aryan invasion or Aryan migration theory, because there's a lot of debate in India, and it's a hotly contested topic. What is not to be contested is North Indians share a lot of their DNA with Europeans. So I did my own DNA test. 10% of my DNA is Eastern European. So that's a case closed, right? And you can find out ancestral North Indian. There's an entire genetic haplotype, and these genes are mostly found in West and North Indians. And even if you just look at a Kashmiri, it's pretty obvious that that person is very close to that of a dark-skinned European.
Yeah, that's true. Because like Kashmiris or people who live in the northern parts of India, they're quite fair-skinned.
Yeah,
Is
and
what I see.
in terms
Yeah.
of their features too, they could pass off for Europeans. On the other hand, if you come to South India, most of those people are dark skinned,
Yeah.
and they look quite different, mostly because they are a mixture of Aborigines and people of the Harappan civilization. So India is like a truly a racial melting pot. So
Wow.
though that was the first migration, and what allowed those people to dominate utterly was that they had bronze chariots, right? Because imagine if you're just a standard infantryman and someone unleashes the power of a horse in a chariot and then just allows you to bulldoze them. So people think that this is what allowed them essentially to dominate them.
And I think one thing that might be the case, or where we see evidence of these things actually being there, there are a few paintings found in several places in the world. I don't know exactly where. I would not want to put out wrong information there, but there were a lot of cave paintings that were found, and like you could tell that those people used chariots. So there's the evidence for that.
And the thing is, this part of history got really corrupted by the Nazis, because what was just seen as like a normal movement of people or a conquest some 3,000-4,000 years ago was unnecessarily politicized, and it was used as a justification for horrifying slaughter. So, it has nothing to do with that. But there are links. There are ancient links between the Germanic people and the Europeans, and especially North Indians, because in fact Sanskrit and Latin have a lot of similarities.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
the
They
link
have
is
origins together.
so genetic, linguistic, like how many more ties do you want? So
I just had a question about the civilizations that were there. Like when you speak or when you think about civilizations, you have the Greek
Yeah,
civilization, you have the Roman
yeah.
civilization. So maybe you were coming to that point,
No, no,
but
this is much later, but yeah.
it's much later.
Yeah.
Okay. But I had a question that, you see them having all these weapons. So when were these, equipment or weapons developed?
So through
It
time, right?
evolved
Yeah,
basically.
evolved with
Right,
time.
right.
So basically, we learn to extract metals. So bronze, it's called the Bronze Age because those metals, the weapons were forged out of bronze, right? So
Okay.
bronze is a mixture of copper and tin. I
Yes.
think it's the 85% copper and 15% tin.
15% tin. Yeah.
And but those weapons could not be mass produced because it is not available in that amount of quantities.
Hmm.
So anyway, these Bronze Age civilizations, then I mean the Indo-Aryan conquests were successful, and eventually those people just integrated. So in Europe, they pretty much exterminated the local population and replaced them. Whereas in India, they assimilated with the population to become the Vedic civilization. Uh, then we come to the civilizations of Assyria, Babylon, and Mesopotamia. Now, Assyrians were known for their brutality. So, how they won was through brutality. So, there is this emperor, his name is Ashurbanipal, and when he destroyed a city, he said, yeah, so I destroyed the entire city, I put salt in the ground, I humiliated the rivals. So, this is how Assyrians did it. And you have to understand geography. So, that area of the world is very flat, and flat land is very easy to conquer because an army can just march through. So logistics, especially in the pre-modern era, were quite difficult. So it was easier to conquer flat plains. So because of that, they gave way to contiguous empires. So as what Assyria would do was take tribute from a bunch of places and brutally repress people. This is when the Assyrians were then replaced by the great Persian civilization. Now, I know Persian civilization is often portrayed in Greek mythology as some sort of like barbaric or whatever, but they were a very, very tolerant civilization. And Xerxes, he called himself an Aryan, by the way. So,
Oh, I didn't
yeah,
know that.
yeah, so
Okay.
Xerxes said, by the great god Ahura Mazda, I have been proclaimed a king, and I'm an Aryan, and I'm a proud Aryan, is what Xerxes said. So basically, Aryan was a cultural identity. It had nothing to do with white skin, because most likely Xerxes looked like, had my skin tone, right?
Possibly.
So, yeah, quite possibly, because modern day Iranians look pretty much like me.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
that's true.
this is what happened, right? So, Persians established a relatively better civilization, and of course, in that time they came across the Greeks, right, or particularly the Spartans, or at that time were known as Lacedaemonians. Right now, the Spartans, pound for pound, were an incredible fighting force. And why do have I picked the Greeks, especially the Greek infantry or the Greek hoplites, as an elite fighting force over the Persians? Is because the Persians had numerical supremacy. They would fire arrows and they were able to conquer because that is what is expected. But the Greek infantry, despite being so small in number, were able to defeat them consistently. And the way they did that was at that time it was considered a revolution, right? And the revolution was that you lock shields together and you put your most experienced people on the boundary, right? So let's say there's a group of men, the most experienced people are on the outside, and the relatively inexperienced or old people are in the center. Because of this, the morale is high because there's nowhere for someone to run. So they have to hold up their shield and they have to hold. And this sort of a turtle formation was, for armies of that time, very difficult to beat because it would just march forward and destroy everything in its path. So this
Right.
was one reason why the Greeks were able to, there's the famous standard Thermopylae, which according to Herodotus happened, but who the hell knows if it.
So out of the Syrians and the
Potamians, yes.
Mesopotamians and the Greek were the best of warriors, is what you would say.
I mean, at that time in the ancient world, if you had to say pound for pound, that is, compared to their small size, who was the most devastating or good fighting force, it was the Greek, especially the
Okay.
Greek hoplites. Then Greeks was eventually conquered by the Romans to form something known as the Pax Romana. Now, Greeks and Romans are very similar people because the Greeks considered themselves, the Romans considered themselves to be inheritors of the Greek culture. So that is why whatever Greek gods are there, Roman gods are the same. So, for example, Zeus became
So yeah,
Jupiter,
I've actually observed
Neptune
that.
became Poseidon, so on and so forth, right? So Greek culture and Roman culture is pretty identical. Where the Romans exceeded was they built a lot of infrastructure. So they were great engineers for their time. They built a lot of great roads. They were excellent organizational structure, and they had something known as the gladius. Now the gladius is a relatively shorter sword, and why would that be beneficial? Is because you have a spear for long term. If I want to kill you from, like, say 10, 20 feet, I have my spear. But if once we are up close and dirty, we're in close quarters combat, then I need a sword. But if I have a giant long sword that I have to swing around, I'll just kill my friends. Gladius allows me for those skirmishes, and that is why the gladius and the trident were invented in that time.
So
And
all these, weapons, if anyone wants to, if anyone is planning kind of a trip to a foreign country, but a very different location, I would say go visit Turkey because they have all these museums which have these weapons that are still
oh,
kept there.
cool.
And there's this city called Izmir in Turkey, modern day Turkey, modern day Izmir. I don't know what
Okay.
it was called that time. But you can go, you can actually see the roads that were built. You have all these things, and they have guided tours. So if anyone's really into this, I would recommend it.
So the Romans were one of the were one of the world empires, right? That is that they really were able to conquer a lot of the world. And what you see often is that the like right from ancient world all the way almost to the First World War, the fastest means of getting from point A to point B was actually the horse. So the
Right, that's
people,
right.
and why were the Yamnai? So Yamnai were charioteers, right? Why didn't they just ride the horse? Because what to us modern people seems pretty self-evident and obvious is very difficult. So imagine you have never even seen a horse or have had no encounter with a horse, and you're suddenly trying to ride, right? The saddle and everything may seem like rudimentary technology, but it's actually extremely difficult. And so, why is this relevant? Because this brings us to the next point of time. And this brings us to one of the people who I feel had one of the most effective militaries in the entire world, that were the Mongols. And just a finishing point on the Romans, what made the Romans so good was that they were able to hold an empire, right? So it's not just about conquering, but it's also about holding territory. So once they conquered a place, they would build a lot of infrastructure, and they established something known as the Pax Romana, right? So system of interconnected roads, something like this. And the Latin as the common uniting culture. They were a martial culture. So often, there's a joke, right, that whenever there's a war, the poor people lose their sons and rich people just lose some of their money, which they then make back. But in Roman times, if you were a nobleman and landholders, then it was moral obligation to fight, right? So if the ruling class has enough moral fiber to actually fight and kill and die for their convictions, then they will be better leaders of society. So Marcus Aurelius, the pioneer of stoicism, was one of them, but eventually Rome fell to decadence as well. Then we come to the Mongols, and the point about the horse is especially relevant because of all the people in the world, the Mongols were the one who were able to truly make the horse become one with the horse. So some say that the myth of the centaur, right, actually comes from watching Mongol people ride. So Mongols were the best horse archers in the world. And why? Because Mongols were steppe herders, right? So the steppe is this vast expanse of just grassy plain, which, like, for literally for kilometers upon kilometers, there's nothing. And they did not have a civilization, right? They were herder people. So they would just keep roaming from place to place in their tents. And they would live on horses. So a Mongol child would learn to ride a horse and walk at the same time. In fact, adult Mongol males had bow legs because they had spent their entire lives in a saddle. So that is why their legs changed. And Mongols could shoot arrows in a way that no one else can. So there are reports of a Mongol, like, they're riding like this, and they would shoot their arrow mid gallop. So if a horse is at full gallop, at one point all the four horses are off the ground, and if you shoot it, and at that moment, the chances of missing are zero, because otherwise the horse will buck and kick. They would have these bows, right? And what allowed the Mongols to be so insanely brilliant, right? For context, that they conquered China, right? They conquered China, which had 100 times their population, and they were able to do it. They conquered Russia in winter. That's a feat that both
Wow.
Napoleon and Hitler could not do. How were they able to do it? because they would ride all day on their horse, and because of this it gave them unparalleled and unprecedented mobility in those days. And they, if they ran out of food, they would mix the horse's blood, and they would just drink the horse's blood
Oh my
for
God.
yeah, and they were brutal warriors. And
I
when
think they also, like the area where they lived in, they had a better tenacity to the harsh weather
yes,
conditions than maybe what people in the southern parts of Europe or Mesopotamia
yeah,
or those areas would, because all these areas they're like cold, but they have a Mediterranean climate. So you
mm,
have warm days and you have cold days.
yeah.
But in Russia, it's brutal. It's
Yeah,
pretty cold.
Mother Russia. But yeah,
That's right.
so what the Mongols were able to do was that they would, so the Chinese people would find the army in one place, suddenly they would be in another place. And under Genghis Khan, he united them and he then unleashed the Mongols on the world, right? And Genghis Khan was really great because he promoted people based on meritocracy. So there was one of his generals, his name was Jebe. And Jebe was a general of the general. Jebe was a soldier in the opposing army, and he shot Genghis Khan with an arrow and caused him to fall off his horse. And Genghis Khan like asked who was it that shot the arrow, and Jebe, came forward and said it was I. And instead of killing him on the spot, he made him one of his generals, and henceforth he was known as Jebe the Arrow because he shot at Genghis Khan. And Genghis Khan was a world conqueror, and I will make no bones, he was as brutal as maybe Hitler, Mao, and Stalin. So there was a common refrain that when Mongols conquered a city, any male who was who was shorter than the wheel of a bullock cart would be slaughtered, and all the women would get raped. So Genghis Khan has something like 10 million.
So I think we should put a trigger warning here
Yeah,
for people who, don't want to. I think we should have done this before, but if
yeah,
you are sensitive to content like this, so maybe just, in like if things like this come up, this video might include that. This is a very late trigger, but
yeah.
I'm just putting it out there
Yeah, and
on
you
the
have
channel.
descriptions like there would be people would say, "Oh, is that a white mountain?" And they would come and it was like a pile of skulls and bones and things like that. So the Mongols were an absolutely terrifying force to the point where people saw them as God's punishment. And the dark humor is that Genghis Khan justified himself by this way because he said, "If your God loved you, he would not have unleashed me on you. I am God's punishment." And that is what he did to the Khwarezmian Shah, right? So the Genghis Khan, there was this empire in Iran, modern day Iran somewhere, that was known as the Khwarezmian Shah. They had some disagreements over trade. Khwarezmian Shah captured one of his emissaries. Genghis Khan conquered, destroyed there, but eventually they assimilated into that culture. So this is one more example of people who go to a place as conquerors and then end up assimilating into the culture.
Okay, but then like when we think about modern day weaponry or
Hmm.
civilized, like how did this evolve into the wars that we see
So
now?
the evolution was that from the Bronze Age we come to the Iron Age, and thank you for bringing it up. I had actually forgotten. So iron ore is much cheaper to manufacture. So bronze weapons at that time were better than iron weapons because iron weapons at that time were softer because the furnace technology had not evolved, right? But once iron weapons began to be mass produced, you could have much more iron weapons than bronze ones. So the iron bronze age ended and it gave way to the bronze age. And in the bronze age, especially as military and furnace technologies, so basically what you need to do is you need to heat iron a lot to very hot temperatures. Then you need to beat it, and beating it kind of reduces the structural imperfections, so on and so forth, and you get a hard piece of metal that can be used to kill someone. Pretty much humanity in a nutshell. So
Yeah, I think like the part about artillery where it began to be developed, that's pretty like so maybe like why don't you tell us about that?
so
Because the way that civilizations evolved or wars evolved is pretty
yeah,
interesting
so
to see
the
about.
from the after the Mongols, you have the early modern period of Teutonic Knights, so
Yeah.
on and so forth. And in that time, especially in Europe, there was no army that had overwhelming supremacy. So like England and France and whatever would keep fighting. Then came the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
So a lot of the reasons how the Industrial Revolution was born actually can be encapsulated into three things: how Europe colonized the world, guns, germs, and steel. right? So Europe actually had went through the entire industrial revolution, and then they began to build weapons, right? They got gunpowder from China. So China had gunpowder way before, but it never put it to use as in weaponry. But Europeans, credit where credit is due, where due to their ingenuity, whatever, they got weapons, and the edge that Europe got due to advanced weaponry, especially things like modern artillery and guns, is insane. So Europeans were able to rule or conquer the entire continent of Africa while losing like 3,000 men. So imagine how big Africa is, how many people, and how small Europe is, and how the conquest happened.
And I think their modern weaponry enabled them to, especially like the British, they have or had colonies
Yeah,
in different areas of the
yeah.
world. They would just travel there by boat. And I think, like, as brutal as it sounds, another trigger warning, but they used to open fire on the poor innocent people.
Yeah,
That's how they could conquer so many
pretty much,
different
yeah.
countries.
I mean, the way that the Zulu and Italians fought was the Zulu had spears and Italians from planes would drop bombs on them.
Yeah.
So the technological supremacy becomes at some point it becomes laughable.
So I think this is where the great breakthrough or the leap happened in, where, like, my question in this whole thing was that where did we actually start seeing guns? So I think the
Yes.
Industrial Revolution was that point, and then it evolved into the First
So
World War,
I think,
I would
please
say.
someone correct me if I'm wrong, but we begin to see the first muskets and so on in 1700s and
Yeah, yeah, that's
1800s.
right.
Then
That's right.
came the Colt, which was
Yeah.
I think it was 18 something. I don't know.
The 1800s, but
I
then
think
the
so.
early 1900s, you come to World War One,
Yeah.
basically. So,
So yeah, but that's more like modern artillery also
right,
made
right,
the
right.
difference.
Yeah.
So what happened there was first, so in that time, right, like I won't say that any army, of course, because of the technological age, the European armies were the best in the world, but still it was no European army was the clear favorite. So you could argue that which army was the best, maybe the French, maybe the English, maybe the Spanish, maybe the Dutch, but it was, and basically they were not going to war against each other. It was more like who could get the territory first, and it was like, okay, whatever. Then we come to the time of the Second World War. So Second World War precipitated with the Archduke of Ferdinand, and then Austro-Hungary, Germany, they all went to war.
I think the World War started when the Archduke Francis Ferdinand, I think, was murdered.
Yeah, he was
Yeah, because
assassinated by Serbian nationalists,
right, right,
and
right.
then Poland or someone went to war, and then I think Austro-Hungary was invaded by Russia, I think, and then Germany went to Russia's aid,
Yeah.
I think, and then France and Britain jumped in.
So I think they all grouped together and then it
Yeah,
like was a
that
mid-attack.
war was pretty much a stalemate because what's not understood about that war, it was trench warfare. So everyone dug in their defenses, and then they would try to suicidally charge across their defenses.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
imagine a bunch of men running into artillery fire. It was horrendous slaughter, and it was pointless, horrendous slaughter. And at the end, Germany lost, but it lost because they could see the writing on the wall, and at that time Germans were not fanatics. You're also forgetting the Franco-Prussian War, where there was also a conflict with
So, if you guys want to see that video, actually, Sharang has uploaded a video on the
yes.
Franco-Prussian War. So, I think it might be in our older videos. So, if you want information on that, you can go see that.
Yeah, and but even in that time, it was like no clear army was the dominant one. And then we come to the Second World War, and there we have the two of the most dominant armies in the world, and they both belong to the losers of the Second World War, which is Imperial Japanese Army and the German Wehrmacht. And why do I say this, right? Because if you look at the Second World War, if you look at the population differences, the Allies were fighting against the Axis. The Allies had roughly like 10 to 15 times their population of Axis. So they had much, much more manpower in terms of resources. Is there any comparison between America and Japan, or America and Germany, or America and Russia together against Germany? It almost on paper it looks laughable and insane. And still the Germans did insanely well, right? So first I'll talk about the German army, and the only word I can describe for the German Wehrmacht and the German Luftwaffe is terrifying. So the German army was known as Wehrmacht, and the German military, or sorry, air force was known as Luftwaffe. Luft means air, and Waffe means weapon. So weapon of the skies. So why was it? Because the Germans, as I mentioned, that the First World War ended kind of in a stalemate, and then they were forced to surrender because of blockades. So because of this, Germans were smarting. They thought they had been humiliated. The Treaty of Versailles was pretty brutal on them. They were frustrated. They wanted to take it out on someone. They found the poor innocent Jews who had done nothing. Anyway, their frustrations gave them to say never again, and we will unleash a horrifying war on Europe. So Hitler said something like, if we lose, then we will exit the world with a bang that shakes the earth. And unfortunately, that evil person was right. Um, why was the Wehrmacht and why was the German army so effective? So in that time, you have to remember that France, because of the trauma of the First World War, had constructed something known as the Maginot Line, which was a line of defense against the German aggression. So what Germans would do was that they would take planes and they would infiltrate behind enemy lines by parachuting, right? So Germans would parachute behind enemy lines and then cause chaos. Another thing that they would do was known as blitzkrieg. So blitzkrieg is where the German soldiers would take meth, then they would sit in tanks and they would cross unimaginable distances in a short period of time. Germans would call it panzer chocolate, or tank chocolate. And so imagine an army that won't sleep for 3 days straight and just invades deep into your territory and then unleashes chaos. And that is basically how Germans were able to beat France, the Netherlands, basically Western Europe, other than England, who had a heroic fight, fell. Then we come to the Eastern Front, which is objectively way more brutal than the Western Front of the war. And what the Germans did to Russians traumatized that generation. Because what the Germans killed 20 million inhabitants of the Soviet Union, and they had planned a genocide. How were they able to defeat such large armies? That is because they would do something as a pincer maneuver. Now imagine there's a giant red army. I put my tanks, but I don't put them like this. I make them go in circles and I do giant encircling maneuvers. And then I pound the center with artillery. And Russian soldiers would surrender, and then they would be put in concentration camps, not fed, and they would starve to death. And
So I think, like, to sum up the Second World War, I would say that, like, things really got crazy there. I
things
mean,
got crazy, and it went into a
nuclear.
nuclear, and
Yeah,
it ended with the nuclear bomb. But
exactly.
yeah, and then we come to the juggernaut of the Second World War, which was America. So America, once it got going, the industrial power that America unleashed on the world was horrifying. And then with the two, at one point, America became the world superpower. Why? Because it had nuclear bombs, ironically built by the same Jews who had been kicked out by Hitler. So that's a poetic irony in the world. But for their small size, the Germans were able to cause a truly terrifying amount of damage. Then we come to the Imperial Japanese Army. The Imperial Japanese Army had the best morale of all people in the entire world. So routinely they would die fighting to the last man, and this is what distinguished them. And this is why in places like Iwo Jima, Americans suffered horrifying casualties. In fact, the Japanese army were able to punch the Europeans in the nose in Burma and liberate those places. So Singapore, so on and so forth. And once those places were wrested from European colonial hands, they never accepted European aggression again.
So,
Also,
like,
no, sorry. Also, what the Japanese did to China was horrifying. So again, they had an overwhelming numerical supremacy, but they were able to conquer people vastly superior than them in terms of numbers. But you can argue for technological supremacy. Yeah, please continue.
um, no, you can go ahead. I'm sorry,
Okay, no
I
problem.
forgot. Yeah.
So, then, like, I think this is the end of this video. Like, uh, these were some of the armies which I feel had overwhelming superiority. And why do I not include the modern era, so on and so forth? Because you could also argue Mujahideen of Afghanistan, or that the Viet Cong, which were able to defeat America, are great fighters. Of course, these people are also great fighters. They deserve our respect. But I mean, in terms of nation states outperforming despite having relatively small populations and relatively few resources. And we have not seen a real war, thank God, and I hope we won't, in recent times on that scale. So of course, like, we are finding out what Russia and Ukraine is becoming, right? And both sides have not performed that great. People expected Russia to steamroll Ukraine, and that hasn't happened. And However, like the last segment of the video would be the fighting cultures of our homeland, India. Right, I think we should conclude on that note. So I'll leave my favorite ones for last. First ones, of course, are the Sikhs of India, a warrior culture. Their entire religion is built on Kutch, Katyar, Kangi, Kripan, right? And they were great warriors in the time of Maharaja Ranjit Singh. Then we have the Rajputs of Rajasthan, who say something like "Shushk dhara par rakt sadam chidakte hai." So they're known for their sacrifice valor. We talk about the Ahoms, who defeated the Mughals 14 times. We must acknowledge the Mughals, even we may not like it. They were able to conquer all of India. So credit where credit is due, I guess. Great fighters, especially because they had a lot of Mongol tactics. So remember how I said Mongols got assimilated into that culture of those places? So basically, Mughals were Mongols. So they had the same horse tactics or whatever, which is why they were able to colonize us. And maybe we were also militarily lacking somewhere. We did not fight within an organization. Then we have South India, which came up where the martial art of India, Kalaripayattu, was born in Kerala. And last, and we'll end with the Marathas. So we are Maharashtrians, and from this soil came this race of brave people known as the Marathas, the Kshatriyas of this land. And not all Kshatriyas, because there was, of course, Baji Prabhu Deshpande, Bajirao Peshwa, so on and so forth. But point being is that under the leadership of Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, he created a band of fighters known as the Marathas, or people from especially people from the Mawar region of Maharashtra, known as Mawle. What was so special about them? Mountain warfare and guerrilla warfare. So at a time when so Mughals had overwhelming military supremacy, they had giant cannons, they would have these large caravans of supplies. And that is where Shivaji Maharaj recognized that that's their weakness. So often what they would do is that they would attack their supply chains, run away, attack, run away. So they pioneered this guerrilla warfare tactics, which was critical in the first stages, because Shivaji Maharaj started with a very, very small Jagir. It was less than a kingdom. And from that, he expanded into the Maratha Empire. So after his demise, the leadership went on to Chhatrapati Sambhaji Maharaj, Raja Ram.
I think that would be like a great content idea for a longer video, right?
Yeah.
Like how the Maratha Empire emerged.
Yeah.
So I think that's one thing.
Yeah. So
But yeah, so this video was very different from the ones that we make. It was pretty like it was explorative in a way, and I personally don't know a lot about this topic, so I read a bit, but I'm not that aware. But I was like, this needs to go out because
Yeah.
it's so interesting. And so we would love to hear what you guys thought
Yes.
about this video. Do let us know, and do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, Sharang and Sharvari.
Yeah.
And hope you guys have a great weekend.
Thank you. Jai Hind. Bye bye.